All right, welcome to the Farmer Friday call. My name is Jess Gnad and I am your host. I'm here today with my co-host, Drew Minnis. Let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here and start my slides from the very beginning. All right, so last week we launched our Farmer Friday webinar series, and we've got 4 lined up. We're in the second one. We've got Todd Tobin joining us. Last week we had Brandon Hunnicutt. Next week we're going to be talking to one of my really good buddies, Dale Strickler. He is the author of several books, including one of my favorites. It's called The Drought Resilient Farm. If you're a producer in dry land, or if you're like most of us on this call and you live in Kansas, this is a great resource for you. And then the 4th week, which will be the week after next, we'll be talking to Jimmy Emmons, Oklahoma producer who has been really instrumental in the soil health space, regenerative ag space, and just somebody that we call a friend. So if you missed last week's presentation, if you pull out your smartphone, and I can't help you if you have a flip phone, sorry, but pull out your smartphone, you can scan the QR code and it'll take you right to the replay. And you can hear us talk to Brandon Hunnicutt. He's on the National Corn Growers Association board. And we talked a lot about different strategies that he's using on his operation at scale to improve soil. He also uses PrairieFood. He's had some really great experience with that. And he also is somebody that is working heavily on some of the USDA climate smart commodities. So if you're interested in that topic, listen to that webinar. I think there's going to be a lot more information coming out on what is a climate smart commodity and how can producers like yourself be a part of it. So thank you all for being at my party. I feel like I've had the soil health bug for a number of years. And in the beginning, it wasn't something that we, not everybody wanted to talk about soil health the way that I did. But my good buddy Todd, he wanted to talk about soil health. And so that's one reason why we have him on the call today. So a few more housekeeping notes. I already introduced myself. I'm Jess Gnad, and my co-host is Drew. Drew's on the line. Hey, Drew.
Why, hello, Jess. I don't mute myself.
And Drew has great aspirations. He grew up on a family farm in Stafford County. Is that correct, Drew?
No, there's no farming in my family. It's we're funeral directing people, 4th generation.
Okay, I misread your bio. And we also have Mark Hines. He's on the line too. He is our soil health agronomist for PrairieFood, and he helps producers one-on-one. And so he might pop in with a couple questions. And so right now we have Todd Tobin. Todd is a producer in Pratt County, Kansas. He's on about 7,000 acres. And for many years, him and his operation, they have worked to develop soil health strategies, which are now implemented on most of his acres. So yes, that means that he's doing a lot of what we're talking about at scale. Some of his practices include no-till, cover crops, and the integration of livestock. Todd has also participated in a lot of conservation programs that has helped him develop this over several years, maybe even decades. And I call him a leader in this space because of his willingness to try new things and his willingness to kind of get after it and put his practice into operation and get things done. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take just another few minutes here and just review a couple things that I recently talked about at a Women in Ag conference that has to do about why we're actually talking about soil health, why this is important. And I know that I'm talking to a really informed audience right now, so I'm going to go very quickly and I'm just going to pop out a few things that I think are really important for us to highlight for this conversation. So soil is alive, and we are treating our soil like dirt in general. And if you think about one handful of soil, if you go out and scoop up a handful of soil, it's alive. And there are more living organisms in that handful of soil than there are to people on the planet. So it's incredibly important. Soil's alive. What we're talking about here is biology. Yes, there's chemistry. But that's one thing that once I realized that soil is alive and we're treating it like dirt and we need to get better. The other thing that I talk about that's just incredibly important for every conversation that we have in agriculture is that soil organic matter. That's the portion of the soil that's alive. That's the portion that almost every producer measures. If you ask them, they're going to know about where their SOM is. But for every 1 point increase of that SOM that you have, or 1%, that equals 25,000 gallons of water that's available to your soil profile per acre. So when you are in historical drought conditions like we are here in Kansas, this is something to really think about, is that if we can increase this by 1 point, to us in Kansas, that's the equivalent of a 1-inch rainfall, just sitting in your soil and your soil profile, having those pore spaces open so that when you get the rain, even though we're not getting a whole lot of rain, you have the ability to capture it. So that was kind of the last part. The last part that I talk about is in the context of the United States. Okay, for example, we know more about the sun, the moon, the stars, galaxies we will never go to. There's been more funding put into outer space black holes than there have been to the study of soil. So wrap your brain around that. What I see right now is in agriculture, we are in a paradigm shift. We are in a place where things are changing. And honestly, producers aren't waiting around, and especially people like Todd Tobin to being told what to do. So we're out there, we're regenerating the soil. The message that I get to take across the United States is that farmers and ranchers are the heroes of climate change by adopting regenerative ag practices. You know, when we have the ability to effectively manage our livestock grazing and our ability to improve the soil health, we can do more for the environment and for climate change than any moonshot carbon capture machine that people are trying to get us to do. So it just blows my mind. The answer is in the soil. So how do we do that? It's the regenerative ag principles. The way in which each producer out there achieves these principles could vary from practice to practice. So don't get hung up on whether it's no-till or reduced tillage or strip tillage. But it's just the basic way of a way that a producer would have different soil health practices on their operation. And it looks different. It looks different in Southwest Kansas than it does Northeast Kansas, right? So these are some of the principles: keeping the soil covered, maintaining that living root all year round, minimizing soil disturbance, integrating livestock. And sometimes we talk about the underground livestock with PrairieFood, the company that I get to work for. We love your underground livestock, and we want to feed that underground livestock, which would be the microbes. And then lastly, maximizing your crop diversity, which I think Todd's going to talk to us a little bit more about that. So I will leave us on this note, and I know everybody's probably sick of hearing me yammer on. I always show this at my presentations. Got cover crops. It'd be a lot cooler if you did. Like literally, if we had more cover crops, if we had more growing plants more times throughout the year, we can cool the planet, right? So wise words from Mr. McConaughey himself, and the future belongs to those of us still willing to get our hands dirty. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Todd Tobin. So Todd, thank you so much for joining our call today.
You bet. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, man. All right. So you're out in the field right now. If you wouldn't mind, just give us a little overview about your location and a little bit about your farming operation.
Basically, we operate in Northwest Pratt County. Pretty sandy ground, variable ground. We're down to about 6,200 acres actually now. So we're pretty diversified in corn, beans, milo, wheat. We grow rye, a lot of rye cover crops. So we started growing rye for our own seed use. We do more diversified cover crops depending on what's out there. We're about half and half irrigated dryland, which is very dry land right now. We have added cattle into the operation in a couple different ways in the last 6 to 7 years. Basically, that's about it. I'd say we're mostly no-till. We had a strip till back in the early 90s as a way to more efficiently put fertility down underneath the plant instead of broadcasting. Other than that, like I say, I love to plant green. We strip till into it, standing covers, and then plant right into that.
So just for context, because we've got people from all across the world here. So those of you that are international, if you don't mind just sticking in the chat where you're from, could you give us an update on the current drought situation in Kansas? Tell us about what's your annual precipitation and what's it look like today?
Right here in Pratt County, I think we're 26 inches of annual rainfall. I just looked at my weather stations before we logged on. We're sitting right at exactly 1 inch for 2023, and that's including the snow melt. Last year we had anywhere from 9.5 to 12 inches of rain. I have 5 weather stations scattered across the farm. I did miss some in January, February, and March where they weren't operational, but I'm thinking it might have been 1 to 2 inches at the most. Last year in the growing season, to put a little bit in perspective, I had 5 circles of corn that when I planted them in June, they got 2 inches of rainfall until they were mature in August.
Wow.
And we had a little bit of rainfall in the fall, just enough to get wheat up. And we're struggling to keep the ground from blowing right now because the wheat's dying, going backwards. And if you don't have, if you didn't have the covers out there, it's literally blowing away acre after acre.
We'll talk a little bit about that. First off, that corn, were you able to get a crop off that corn that only got 2 inches?
Irrigated, we did.
Irrigated, yeah.
Yes, we actually had a pretty good year on our farm, but we only cut 90 acres of dryland milo. We cut 0 on corn and 0 on beans on the dryland acres last year.
Yeah. Pamela, California is a different country. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that you're in California and it's a different country. And I just want to tell everybody, Frank is not a troll. He's actually from Australia, but it looks like his video is having problems. So we'll keep him in the call. So Todd, just in context of the years that you've been farming, where would you kind of rank this drought? And what's your mindset going into this drought now that you have a little bit more of a soil health focus? Has that changed the way you view it?
As far as ranking this drought, it's definitely the worst one I have ever seen, period. And I got in basically off and on since 1989. So I've been doing it a little while. But every neighbor around, the older generation, the 70, 80, and even some 90-year-olds said this is the worst they can ever remember. As far as longevity and just the duration and least amount of rainfall they've ever seen in that length of time.
Yeah, I was at the Kansas Ag Expo yesterday in Hutch at the fairgrounds, and I was talking to this older gentleman. He's so convinced we're going to break it this year. He's so convinced. He spent about 20 minutes telling me about his entire life. And I love that about the farming and ranching community, is just that optimism. And I hope he's right. I hope that we are able to break out of this. So let me ask you a little bit about cover crops, because, you can't plant cover crops out here. I mean, it'll suck your moisture, right? So if you just talked about how one of your main goals of the cover crops are to keep the soil from blowing this time of year. I've lived in Pratt for 13 years, and I know exactly what you're talking about when you talk about the soil blowing. So can you just break that down a little bit? I mean, how are you able to get this cover crop going? And you've been doing it for a long time. And I understand it's on a majority. You're doing cover crops at scale. So, and also I think are you drilling cover crops right now?
I am. I'm actually sitting in the tractor and I stopped at the end. We're actually drilling oats. I quit drilling on the dry land a couple weeks ago. Just, we can't get them established yet. But I'm actually trying to thicken up my covers on my irrigated ground right now. We pulled cattle off and we're drilling oats into that to try to get a little bit more biomass before we plant into that. I live in kind of 2 different worlds here. Irrigated, everything's easier. We can generally always get a good cover crop on here. Dry land is another beast. The dry land covers that I seeded last summer, very few came up. The ones that did sprouted and died. So we were kind of behind the 8 ball on that. we actually quit seeding after a couple hundred acres, just put the seed back in a tote, put it back in the shed, and we'll hopefully use it this year. In our area, it's difficult to get a summer cover going. That's been our biggest struggle and our biggest challenge. I'm gonna rethink my cover crop program a little bit on dryland acres. On my easier acres, I'll continue with the diversified mix behind the combine. On the harder acres, which is my very low CEC soils, very sandy soils, organic matter is very low on those. I'm going to go to a more intensive cropping rotation and get more diversified roots, but it's going to be more of a cash crop. We're going to add sunflowers back in the mix, some canolas, of course, stick with wheat, rye, different rotations, but we want to really more or less move into a more intensified cropping rotation to get our diversified roots in. Just because 3 out of 5 years getting covers established, I think I can do better by going to that type of a scenario. And you mentioned it's a systems approach. You can leave out 1 or 2 of the systems, except for the tillage. If you're going to be full tillage, you're going to destroy everything you're trying to build every time you go out there and work that ground up. Sometimes tillage is a necessary evil. I get that. And we have to do tillage once in a while, but it's an overall systems approach, with feeding your microbes, which through the different root structures, that really helps on your soil aggregates and loosening up your soil. We've got guys around us right now that, because we're so dry, they're out there with track hose and dirt movers and cleaning out the tailwater pits and digging them deeper and bigger, because we have trouble with runoff when we do get big rains. Well, my soil, we have doubled to quadrupled our water infiltration rates through the use of no-till and cover cropping. By breaking that soil up, a lot of guys in this kind of cult, they'll say that when you ask them how much rain they get, and they say, well, all of it, because we're not running at all. And that's one of my sayings that I've copied from other guys, but I like to use that. If you can harvest that rainfall and store it in your soils, we've been doing this quite a while. Like I say, I didn't realize how long until I actually stopped and added up. But we're into our 18th year of CSP contracts. Now, year 1, 18 years ago, we came into this as green as can be and just did exactly what they told us to do, followed the guidelines. We did it for a paycheck. But then as you get to doing it, you start seeing the different benefits, and then the programs change and they evolve, and we've kind of evolved with them, trying to take advantage of, there's help out there to get some of this stuff started. And that's kind of how we started with it years ago.
Yeah. And I think that was, we talked to Brandon Hunnicutt quite a bit last week, and I'm hoping that there's more that come out. Some of those programs had quite a few barriers that kept producers in certain practices. And it seems to me like that's changing, that's evolving, that we're able to get a little bit more. So you gave me so many amazing nuggets just now. I want to go back and talk to a couple of them. First off is it's a systems approach. It's farming in Mother Nature's image. But the one thing you talked to me about is getting all the rainfall. And you said the words, you have different root structures. So when you plant multiple species on a single acre, can you talk about this a little bit? The way that I understand it is that each different species, the roots will go down to different layers in the soil and either pull out different nutrients, different microbes. So how does having all of these different species in the soil help you get capture that water?
It's basically the root structure, and we're just starting to touch on this stuff. I am no expert by any stretch of the imagination. We've just noticed where we've had different types of weeds, cover crops, we notice a difference in the soil structure. And there's different, like the rye, it roots deep. We use tillage radishes. We've had 6-inch around, 4-foot deep tillage radishes go down if they're planted early enough to get that kind of growth. We use a lot of turnips because cattle eat the tops, but they also will mine some of that nutrient, bring it right back up to the top and set it in the bulbs. We're adding more and more diversity every year. And I'll admit, in the dry environment, some of those things are going to be wasted money. One year, the next year they might come up. We're looking at adding buckwheat, for example. It will help with the utilization. It's a high calcium user. It will use the calcium and spit out the phosphorus, which helps with phosphorus intake for the next crop. But the different amount of roots, and we wanted to get away. I didn't start on it for a soil structure approach. I started on it because I wanted to get away from a monoculture. We were corn, wheat, and rye covers, back to back to back. Well, that's grass. So we were starting to get load up on the carbon side because they are high carbon sequestration plants, and we need to add some legumes. We need to add some brassicas, have some different stuff out there, and that's when we're really starting to see the different root structures actually help in water penetration and water infiltration in the soils.
There's room for that precipitation to actually infiltrate your pore spaces. Ray Archuleta would start yelling at this point, pore spaces. So Todd, what we were kind of talking about this earlier this week about how do you select cover crop blends, and maybe what are you finding success with on the dry land cover crop blends? And do you have something that you really like on the irrigated? And I'll say that, I've done enough of these calls and panels to where people, they just want the prescription, like, tell me what to plant and I'll go do it. But I know you well enough to kind of know where you're going to go with this answer, but tell us a little bit about your journey of cover crop selection.
It's just getting started kind of in my mind. I mean, we've been doing covers. Anytime you plant beans out here in the sand, the minute the combine pulls off, you need to drill it back to wheat or rye.
Does that happen a lot? Do people do that?
A lot of people in this area do that.
Yeah.
But then we were coming in my mind, we were coming in the spring and we were terminating that way too early. Because we still were borderline blowing by the time we planted. So we started leaving them longer and longer. And then through CSP forcing us to do a cover crop on every acre within 5 years, that really opened my eyes on dry land too. And the multi-species blends, I think they're a good thing because it's a logistical nightmare for a seed company if 200 people all want 200 different blends.
They want a specialty blend, yeah.
Like I say, you're going to pay for some seed that you're probably not going to get benefit from. But if you'll stick with a multi-species blend and plant it for, say, 2 years, 3 years, you're going to see a different reaction every year depending upon Mother Nature. We talked earlier about just about the time I get it figured out, Mother Nature says, oh, wait a minute, this guy's getting a little too confident. And makes us very humble very quick. One of the best years I had was we had phenomenal covers. Everything, massive amount of biomass. Was the first year the sugarcane aphids came into the area. I was very heavy on the cheapest feed seed I could buy with a whole bunch of other species, but we were heavy on that feed mix. Sugarcane aphids came in and wiped it all out.
Yep.
We were lucky enough to have other species in there to hold our ground through the rest of the year, but it's just like that. Now the next year it worked fine, and the 2 years prior to that worked fine. But you've got to have that diversity out there to handle if you're having a pest issue, a weather issue. Right now, I'd say my covers in the last 14 months have been pathetic at best, but you've got to have rainfall.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
the limiting factor.
That is absolutely the limiting factor. So I'm like totally throwing questions at you that I just now thought of in my head. Have you ever had an experience with a pest that maybe didn't affect your fields because of using better soil health, that maybe something was going through the county? I just completely made that question up, but I've heard other people say that there's been certain things that either they've got like a higher bricks on some of their crops, or they've got more diversity so that there's not that attraction. But has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, and we're just diving into that. But if you can keep your plant healthier, and an easy way to measure that health is a Brix reading, which is the amount of sugars in your leaf or your sap. So I actually bought a bunch of refractometers last year, and we've been monitoring Brix on almost everything. And what we found out is the healthier your plant, you may have a heavy infestation in your area, but we don't see that we've got the damage that even right across the street they'll have on the same crop, similar conditions. We're actually, I use a lot of molasses, and last year we pumped molasses.
Yeah.
We pumped molasses on corn, and I think we pretty well effectively controlled the spider mites on our corn crop, at $3 to $4 an acre. And then we didn't have to go out there and put a chemical on there. Now last year we didn't have as high an infestation of spider mites in the area, but which is odd because usually hot and dry for spider mites. But yeah, we're using the molasses is kind of artificially raising your Brix levels, but for an insect pest, if you can get your Brix levels, 12 to 14, you're virtually not going to have any insect that wants to feed on that plant.
Yeah, they're no longer, it's not their appetite. Do you pour some sugar on me in the cab of the tractor when you do that molasses or not?
Do we what?
Do you play the song "Pour Some Sugar on Me"?
Yeah.
You do that?
Yeah, I've actually heard that a time or two.
Are you a hard rocker?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so for those that don't know, and I don't know if anybody has a chance to stick a link in the chat about what a refractometer is, the Brix. I mean, what is this? A $30 instrument that uses
it's very simple. Basically, a refractometer. The sugars in the sap. I took a pair of 10-wort vice grips. I go out and I pull the leaves. I wad them up. I use them vice grips to squeeze a few drops onto this refractometer screen, and then you just flip it over and look into the sun with it. And the sugars basically refract the sunlight at a different rate, depending upon the level of sugar in the sap. So they do make very accurate electronic ones, which I'll probably get one this year, just because you put it on there, you read it. When you're looking into the sun, you will see that. And it's hard to tell between a 12 and a 13, or maybe a 13 and a 15. But with the digital ones, it'll actually read out 11.8. So it'll break it down a little bit more accurate. But just like I say, we throw these in the pickups, and we'll start measuring Brix, especially if we know it's getting time to be any type of insect. If they're going to start hitting, due to the calendar, they're always hit about that time. We try and raise that Brix level so that we just don't have an issue with it.
Well, and here towards the end of the call, I'll pull up our agronomist, Mark, and he'll talk a little bit about, he uses a chlorophyll device out in the field. And so just as a side note, Mark, I'm giving you a heads up that I'm going to call on you in a few minutes. But just getting back to this Brix, talking about increasing your soil health, what decision do you actually make using this Brix? So you said you're out there monitoring it. So you look at it. What decision do you make, agronomically?
It's one of the many tools. I mean, we want to naturally have our Brix levels that high anyway. The goal is to not have to add molasses or sugars across the top. If you can get that plant at that level naturally, you're going to fight off everything that is out there. We're doing it artificially by applying the sugars. And you do with molasses, I will admit, you have to do it with a foliar application of something to get it into the plant. The carbon chains are too big to go in by themselves, so they need to basically attach to a topical fertilizer. We pumped it through the systems with 28%. It seemed to work fantastic.
That's a filler.
But like I say, it's a systems approach. As you get the soil healthier, and the molasses, even soil applied, will feed your microbes because it's a complex carbohydrate. It will feed the soil. So anything that's not going on through foliar will actually go in through the soil also, and then help feed your microbes. So it's kind of a win-win on applying it and feeding your microbes. The more microbial activity you have, the healthier your soil, and then of course healthier plants.
Well, and we talked about the human body is made up of more microbes than actual human being cells, and we love sugar. And guess what? Your soil does too. So I didn't know if Mark was on the line, but are you on there, Mark? I don't see your name. I just see a phone number. But that's okay if you're not. I'll come back and call on you because I had a few more questions. Okay, so Todd, we talked a little bit about the bricks and about just different ways that you can look at your soil health and make decisions on the farm. You said something earlier about planting green. Okay, and this might be some more of our fun conversations of drinking the Kool-Aid and trying to figure this out. So let's go backwards. What is planting green and how are you using it on the farm? And yeah, let us know a little bit about that.
Planting green is basically not terminating your covers until planting time. And there's different ways to terminate. Like this year, our covers are so thin and so short that about the only way you're going to terminate is chemically. My ultimate goal is to always have enough biomass out there. We're going to go to a crimper and start crimping. Right now, we just leave it stand, which doesn't make my agronomist real happy because you can't walk the rows if you're planting in the 5-6 foot tall standing rye.
He walks them?
Strip. Yeah, you have to find a track where the tractor goes and walk down that row. So it makes it. I just tell them it keeps them in shape.
Yeah.
But planting green is basically not terminating the cover crop, and it's actively growing while you're planting. And that's the way I like it. We've had trouble in the past. If we terminate it, it goes down, it gets brittle, or it gets ropey, depending on what's out there. And then you have balling up trouble, wrapping, all kinds of stuff. It's just something we've learned over the years. Just leave it growing, leave it rooted down, and plant right through it.
So how common of a practice is planting green, and what do you need any additional equipment to do that, or how have you had to adjust your planter to plant green?
I'd say if you're no-till, very minor modifications or adjustments basically to the planter. Guys that are making a switch from conventional till might have a little bit more issue. A no-till planter might be set up just a little bit different, but it's very similar. Now, on all our irrigated, where we're running lots of cattle throughout the winter, grazing our covers, we will run a strip till unit through it, and we do apply a little bit of dry through the strip till, depending on what soil tests show. But basically, we're clearing off that strip, so we'll strip till right in front of the planter, and then we'll come back and plant on that strip, which virtually eliminates all my wrapping and issues on the planter. But we do also do quite a bit of no-till right into it also. But the main reason for that strip till is it all depends on Mother Nature and when the cattle come off and what soils are like. But we'll have a little bit of compaction in the very top of that soil. It's not necessarily the compaction that bothers me, it's the roughness. And that planter needs to run smooth to keep the seed placement at the depth. That's our main reason.
It probably helps out a lot with impaction though, too, going into planting. So, because you think, well, I need to loosen up the soil, get it ready for planting. So this making sure you bring that cover crop green all the way up into when you're getting ready to plant. It probably helps out a lot with that, I would assume.
It does. And what we've noticed is with the covers actively growing, when we pull the cattle off, it doesn't take very long for them, the small roots up top, to really break that back up.
Yeah.
You drive across it in a pickup and you don't realize you're falling in 2 to 3 inches in dry ground just because it's so mellow on top.
Yeah.
But it's more the hoof tracks that we're concerned about, and getting a seed bed there.
So I'm going to ask you about cattle, and then our Mark's on the line. He's going to talk, and this is a good segment back over to chlorophyll. Talk to us a little about your decision to integrate grazing back on your circles. And I know that's not something that you've done. I mean, you've done that in the past, but at what point did grazing turn into a soil health strategy for you?
Basically, you go to regenerative meetings and no-till in the plains, soil U, that kind of stuff, and everybody is talking. You can do it without cattle, but you can speed up the process immensely by adding the cattle. And it is something that happens to that plant when it's being grazed on, and the root exudates increase, and so on and so forth. I basically, like almost all of us, were driven by the almighty dollar. I was getting a lot of money tied up in cover crops, and I was looking as a revenue stream to help offset that. So we started talking to a local guy and working with him, and it helps to have a guy that's very flexible on the cattle side. We don't. My main goal is still have covers there when the cattle are gone.
Yeah.
And a lot of guys I used to work with, when they pull off, it was about as bare as the road in between them. And that's something you don't want to do. You're defeating your purpose. So we'll only put on about 3/4 of a head per acre, but they go on right behind the combine, and then they're there until April. So they stay there. It becomes home. They're easier to handle. If they do get out, they don't wander far, and it has turned into a pretty good revenue stream. Like I say, I added it to offset my cover crop costs, and it does that and more. So it's allowed me to get a little bit more extensive in my covers. And when you're looking at spending $35 an acre, you don't want to spend another $2 here, $2 here on, let's try some clover, let's try some hairy veg, some common veg. But now that it's not that big an issue on cost because you're offsetting it with the cattle dollars, a little bit more open to try some more diversified stuff in there. And that's when we really got into more diversification on our winter covers, is because we're actually offsetting most of those covers with the cattle income that's coming off of there.
What's your cattle guy think? I mean, is he enjoying the rate of gain? Does it stay on par with what he wants?
It depends on the year. This year's going to be very disappointing, just because we didn't have the amount of covers, and it seems like we're way behind. Even the stuff coming out of dormancy just has not grown very well. He's happy. You build frame on these cattle. They're sitting there for those months. I will admit most of our gain is going to come in the month of March and April. We pulled off a little early this year. I'm a little bit later planner, so I don't care if we run through the month of April.
Yeah.
We even ran into May last year, but it all depends on what covers out there. That's the reason we did kind of pull off a little early. If the cattle aren't gaining, they might as well find a new home, and we'll give the ground a rest. And that's why I'm out here reseeding or interseeding more oats to try and get some more cover.
Well, like you said, it's a systems approach, and when you're looking at it as a system, our good friend Rick Clark, I know you've met him and talked to him. He says he's got a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. I mean, you just keep going. You just keep planning,
It's not easier. I'll guarantee you that. It is not easier. It is a and there's so many aspects to the system, from the soil health, the water infiltration, the fertility, sampling. We're actually adding sap sampling this year. So we
Okay.
will send sap samples to the lab, which we've done tissue sampling for quite a while. And it gives you a snapshot of where you're at and where you've been the last 10, where you're up to now. Sap sampling will give you a snapshot of where you're going to go for the next 2 weeks. It's going to be a very
Yeah.
good tool, I think, to add to the management of our fertility, both the sugars and the foliar applications of what we're doing, and basically trying to manage pests and fertility.
So understanding SAP analysis, we need to have a whole call on that. Okay.
Yeah, it's very, very complicated. But I think it's new. It's
Yeah.
virtually very new to the US. So it just like covers the different species out there have evolved. But it's going to be a very good tool, I think, for us to use in the future.
So basically you're grabbing these SAP analysis in the growing season, and they help you make decisions for the next 2 weeks, whether it's fertility, pressure, stuff like that. And I think that's fantastic that, I don't know, it just keeps you really, really interactive, right? And it gives you these different paradigms to make decisions. So the one thing I was going to pull Mark up on the call, and I apologize because I think he's on his phone. And I think Mark,
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'm trying. I
Yes,
don't
can you hear
see
me?
you, but I can hear you. So,
Okay, sounds good.
yeah, Mark, if you had a minute, one thing that you've observed over the last growing season, and Mark is a very, very seasoned agronomist, you kind of had some fantastic aha moments using chlorophyll and looking at how you can analyze chlorophyll. So if you want to just dive in and tell us a little bit about what you learned, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear me. I'm traveling up the interstate here, but the chlorophyll meter is an instrument that measures leaf greenness, okay, like in corn. And since corn is a luxury consumer of nitrogen, what do I mean by that? Well, there are two forms of nitrogen that get into the corn plant, either nitrate nitrogen or ammonium nitrogen. Those are the only two forms that can go across that root membrane into that plant. Well, chlorophyll is in the mesophyll cells of the leaves of that plant, and once that plant has sufficient nitrogen, the leaf greenness will not change. So even if you add more nitrogen, the leaf greenness would stay relatively the same. So this is what makes this instrument so paramount in management of nitrogen inputs, in that it gives us 4 to 6 weeks ahead of what your naked eye can see for you to forgive your sins. So like if you're used to putting urea through your pivot, for example, or something like that, you can apply nitrogen, but you'll know that you'll have the need 4 to 6 weeks ahead of time. And it has been correlated, calibrated using statistics and proven with the USDA ARS. We know that a 95% sufficiency, for example, will result in a 6% yield loss, whereas a 90% sufficiency index will result in a 12% yield loss, okay, if you do not correct it. So the beauty of the chlorophyll meter is no matter what else you're testing, you'll know if you have sufficient amount of nitrogen just by running the chlorophyll meter, and the results are immediate. You don't have to wait on a lab. You don't have to wait on the samples, and you don't have to worry about, the various cloud covers that influence, like either your sap samples and or your leaf tissue samples are subject to what is the current weather at that precise moment when you collect the samples. Okay? So it's a tool. It's a tool. It's another tool for us to help manage the nitrogen. So like we had plots last year where we had PrairieFood and where we did not. And it told us ahead of time on one pivot that we had sufficient nitrogen, not to worry about it. It told us on another pivot, however, that we needed to add supplemental in. So this gives us enough time to have either the organic or the inorganic nitrogen forms available for that plant. and you can make management decisions from there without involving the use of a lab someplace else.
Well, I think that's fantastic, Mark. And I think that that's something that, you know, like with PrairieFood, you handle a lot of our green glove service, and that's something that you're able to bring to producers. What I really like about this conversation is building a new framework for decision making. Whether you're taking a look at the chlorophyll, whether you're taking a look at the sap, whether you're just out there doing more scouting and even root digs. That's another one that I know both of you will go out there and do, and take a look at the root and the soil structure and do. So I just think it's really great that we're able to give through this regeneration, soil regeneration, we're able to also give the parameters of how to make decisions. Because if you just, you know, Todd, I think we've talked about this, you can go to the soil health use, you can go to the no-till in the plains, but if you don't have the ability to drive back to the farm and actually apply some of those things that you learned. I remember several years ago going to a conference with you, and both of us just like filling up a notebook of notes. And then all of a sudden you get home, you're like, okay, what do I do with all of that information that I just learned? So Mark, I think that's fascinating. Would you say that's a common, are producers out there using chlorophyll, and are agronomists doing that? Is this new? Is this old? Or it seems to me like with the current state of ag input prices, that I would be figuring out how to use bricks, how to use tissue, and how to use chlorophyll. These seem like real, you know, entryway ways that you can get in here and make decisions.
Well, I'm surprised growers do not have chlorophyll meters. I think they really should. They would, of course, have to have a little bit of training on how to use it, but I think it's going to become a very important tool for our growers to win. I'm not opposed to training them. I'll be happy to help them. You know, and as far as like bricks, and as far as like leaf tissue analyses, I don't have any criticisms against them, other than the correlation calibration statistics is not there to back it. It might be a great index number, but I'm not sure if that translates into bushels. Okay, and so I mean, I don't know those variables yet. But I think they are getting more accurate as time goes on. The chlorophyll meter has been proven by other scientists and is accepted by American Society of Agronomy. And so I'm very privileged to have that knowledge.
Well, that is fantastic. Okay, so we are getting to the top of the hour here, and Todd, I know you're busy and I know you got to get going. But this is a time where we're going to take questions from the audience. So if you want to turn on your camera, if you want to take questions, we'll take a few minutes here. While you're doing that, you can either add them to the chat or you can raise your hand. But Todd, we had a question in the chat here, and it was from our good buddy, Brian Alexander. I hope he's still on the line. And he said he was talking to one of your neighbors that lives south of you, south in southern Pratt County. And there's producers that he said they're adamant that it's too steep for no-till in southern Pratt County. So you're northern Pratt County, which the county is not that big. So talk about it being too steep. What experience do you have on your farm about that?
Well, the slopes, basically they're talking about getting runoff and getting gullies in it is what I'm assuming he's talking about. And that's why the covers are very important. You need that root structure to keep. What you want to try and do is on the water. In some places, you're just not gonna. You know, the Grand Canyon is the best evidence of the water erosion. But basically, if your slopes are that steep, should it be farmed in the first place? But other than that, if you want to keep that water from moving laterally, and you want to move vertical with it. So by building your soil water infiltration rates, which basically the only way you're going to do that is with root structures and different roots out there, to basically make that water go down, not laterally. That's about the quickest layman's terms I can put it in. You know, you got to keep it from going laterally, or you're going to have washouts. And I'm not saying we never have a washout on some of the slopes here. It happens, but you want the water to go vertically, not laterally.
Yeah. Brian, are you still on? the call. I was looking for you earlier. We need to have Brian be a speaker on our call. He's actually the host of Ranching Reboot podcast. And that's another fantastic resource. If you want to learn a little bit more, do some deep dives with Brian. Ranching Reboot is a great place to find it. And who knew we had so many soil stars in the Pratt County area, but things are, I mean, I'm biased because I used to live in Pratt, but I definitely feel like there is a movement and a shift, and we're bringing a lot more folks to the table on soil regeneration. And Todd, you are a leader because you've been consistent, you've been out there doing it. And I think also, well, before the call, Todd and I were talking, and I was just asking about, I know he does kind of some wild and crazy things too. So he was doing the Johnson Sioux bioreactors. Several years ago, I came out and shot a video of one of his guys putting together a bioreactor. It was a really cool experience. So Todd, I mean, I feel like maybe you've gone from maybe being that guy in the county doing something weird to now you're the guy in the county that's really leading the way with soil regeneration. And I thank you for that. And I think all that you're doing, you're also bringing your peers into the fold. You're very, very open to questions and everything like that. So just for everybody on the call, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Like I say, I'm far from an expert, but we're just trying to learn from our mistakes and keep going.
That's right. That's all you can do. And thank you for being committed and motivated to do at scale. So any other questions, guys? We are totally open. Frank had a question here. He said, does anyone up there sow grazing oats into pasture without turning the whole pasture? Just using weighed points. I don't know about that. Frank, are you still on the call? Because you can just, I think Frank got off because he didn't have great cell reception where he's at.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, down here a few years ago, there was an experiment in grazing situations where they were direct drilling grazing oats into existing pasture on about 2 foot centers using wide points. So the only soil disturbance was the wide point to get the oats in, and then it was just a grazing crop that it just came through, and they put stock through it, be sheep or cattle, without having to destroy their pasture, but they were just getting that extra bulk from the oats.
I don't know if I know anybody that's doing anything like that. Frank?
Yeah, in our area, we have very little grass right here locally. It's mostly farm ground. So you get south of us, there's more and more grass, but in my area in northern Pratt County, there's just very little grass for grazing, period.
Right.
Okay.
The other thing was, do you go under daylight saving this weekend?
No, we did it. We did 2 weeks ago. We did daylight savings. Do you do daylight savings in New Zealand?
In Australia.
Australia.
Yeah, we come off great at daylight saving this weekend. So next week I've got to get up at 2 a.m. to log in.
Oh no. Well, thank you. So it's 3 a.m. now, but next week it'll have to be 2 a.m.
Yeah.
Well, we just love having you here, Frank. Thank you. Hey,
Jeff,
Pamela.
I had an input on your oats. So the oats probably improve your mycorrhiza network in that soil regime, and so by increasing that mycorrhiza fungi network, this helps the plants to procure their nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other micronutrients. So I think that'd be a real plus in a pasture situation, or heck, in any row crop situation too.
No.
All right. That was Mark. Thank you. All right, guys. Well, we're getting to the top of the hour. We're going to finish off here. So if anybody needs to get going, thank you so much, Todd. for being with us today. Get back to drilling your cover crops. Keep us updated. Let us know how it goes. We're going to be working with Todd through PrairieFood. He's doing a number of trials with us, some extended season trials and some bigger trials. So I think we'll pull that back up in one of our next Farmer Friday and talk a little bit about the research that you're doing with PrairieFood. And thank you for being willing and open to learning new things alongside us.
You bet. Thank you.
All right. All right, folks. We'll see you next week, and we'll be talking to our good buddy, Dale Strickler, who wrote the book, Drought Resilient Farm. Actually, he's written 3 books, and one of them is a textbook on regenerative agriculture, and it's the only one that I know of. Maybe there is other ones, but our expert speaker next week is Dale Strickler. All right, folks. We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jess.
Hey, okay, I'm going to figure out how to stop recording. Oh, there we go.